Hello, and welcome to the Practitioner Scholar, the PennCLO podcast. In this podcast, we journey through the intersection of academic rigor and real-world impact, spotlighting the practitioner scholars who are shaping the future of organizational learning and leadership. Whether you're an aspiring leader, a seasoned executive, or simply intrigued by the transformative power of education and research, this is the place for you. So sit back and prepare to unlock new perspectives as we delve into the compelling stories and insights that will define the future of learning and leadership.
Hello, I'm Dr. Sharon Ravitch from the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. I'm delighted to invite you back to a really special episode of the Practitioner Scholar, the PennCLO podcast. Dr. Bridie Fanning is here with us to talk with us about her chapter, Leadership in the Age of AI, in our new book, Leaders as Architects of Change, edited by myself and Dr. Raghu Krishnamoorthy, the PennCLO director at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Fanning, we go back a long way. I'm so delighted that you are a featured chapter in this book, and I'm excited for everyone to learn from your deep well of wisdom about this topic and more broadly about leadership and systems. Welcome. Please introduce yourself.
Oh, Sharon, thank you very much. Yes, you were my dissertation chair. So, Bridie Fanning, I'm a managing director with Accenture, a global professional services company. I was with Boston Consulting Group before that as a senior advisor, and I've actually been a chief HR officer of multiple public companies, private equity firms, startup, and I worked for General Electric for 11 years around the globe, Switzerland, Poland, Czech Republic, and I moved to the US in January 2000. And now I'm in consulting with Accenture.
You bring a wealth of industry knowledge to this, to your chapter, and to this conversation today. So let's jump in. Bridie, you open your chapter with a striking claim that AI is now where the internet was 30 or 40 years ago. What do you mean by that? And why does it matter for leaders now? We know it does, but why and how does it matter for them?
Yeah, sure. So both the internet and AI are what we call general purpose technologies, which means they have broad application across many different industries and occupations. And as they develop, they give rise to a multitude of complementary innovations and new business ventures. Think of the smartphone and then think of Uber. A whole new business created because we had access to smartphones. And if you think early on in the 1990s, people couldn't possibly have imagined what the internet would have given rise to. When I met my husband back in 1992, he was all excited. He was an IT guy, very excited about this new invention called the internet. He said, but he wondered if it was really going to take off because he couldn't find anything on it. And of course, Google came along in 1998 and solved that problem. But even when general purpose technologies materialize, they can take a long time to actually see the impact of all these complementary innovations. If you think about the internet and think about retail, it took nearly 3 decades for internet shopping to really disrupt the big box retailers. Mm-hmm. Adoption grew steadily. We were all shopping on the internet, buying off Amazon. But the real inflection point came through the lockdowns, through the pandemic.
That's right.
And then when they lifted, people's behavior had permanently changed. And they just didn't go back to their old ways of doing things. Companies like Walmart had basically launched online businesses to compete just like Amazon. And they did that very successfully, but other retailers really struggled with that. And they were able to weather the storm. But we've seen what's happened now with all these big box retailers, but look how long it took for that to happen. And ultimately, it comes down to the difficulties of adapting business models, the barriers to adoption, the necessary investments. All these things contribute to a lag between the technology being launched and its actual broader impact being felt. And this is what we call Amara's law in action. We overestimate a technology's impact. There's a lot of hype. You remember the dot-com boom. And then dramatically, we underestimate really its long-term impact. And it takes time. But you asked about leaders and why does it matter right now? I mean, the internet was a host for a whole catalyst of innovations, cloud computing, smartphones, social media, trillion-dollar companies like Apple, Google, and we couldn't imagine the scale of what it was all likely to become. And AI is going to be very similar. The new industries, the new business models, and the new companies that will be built on top of AI, they're the things that leaders really need to be preparing for now, not just reinventing their current processes.
That's exactly right. Well, and your chapter title is Leadership in the Age of AI. So I'd love for you, what is the single most important argument you want leaders and learning professionals to walk away with to really understand and plow into what they're doing next week and next month?
Yeah. You know, future of work, it's not going to be determined by the technology. It's not going to be determined by AI, right? It's going to be determined by leaders and the choices leaders make and the choices leaders make now. Those leaders that take a watch and see approach could really risk being left behind as the adoption takes off and the new innovations come into play. Technology itself is neutral, and the outcomes, right. And the outcomes really depend on the choices that leaders make, and they've got a choice. It can either generate extraordinary value for their customers, invent new business models, or it can displace people and widen inequality gaps. And depending on which future gets realized is really going to come down to leaders, where they invest, and before they're forced to through market forces, which are going to come. So fundamentally, AI it's a people story. The AI doesn't adopt itself, right? It's a learning technology, and this technology learns alongside and with people. It gets better as it interacts with people. It's not an innate thing that's separate to people. It really is a partner. And I describe it in the chapter as like a co-worker.
Exactly.
Right. And what it really requires is for people to understand it, trust it, integrate it into their daily work. And the more that it scales, it's going to depend on people's buy-in. And that buy-in depends on leadership and leaders creating the trust, the psychological safety for people to experiment, for them to role model the adoption themselves, and that ultimately leaders can choose who benefits from AI. Some are going to use it for productivity and cost reduction, but those that really kind of think about these new innovations are the ones that I think are really going to own the future, if you like, going forward.
I absolutely agree. And when you talk about coworker, it makes me think of Ethan Mollick's frame of co-intelligence. And that's really what you're the management arm of his conceptualization that we need to learn how to learn with AI and that it can exponentialize our learning, but when we are a part of it. And so that's the people first and the human-centered piece of this that you're bringing, and the way that you're framing these issues is so vital. You specifically describe in your chapter 3 waves of AI: AI, generative AI, and agentic AI. And I'd love for you to explain what agentic AI is and why it's changing the stakes for organizations.
AI has been around for some time, probably a decade or more. Gen AI, launched onto the scene through Chat GPT, and the adoption of that I talk about, it's well documented and reported in the news headlines, faster than any technology in history. And now we have agentic AI. And why that's such a game changer is it's able to not just take the decisions and processes, but actually act on it. So you can now have a situation where back in 2023, a customer service rep could use AI to write a letter or a memo to a customer. Now, that same AI working with agentic can write a letter, make a payment to a customer, and follow up with anything that they need to, actually autonomously. Although we do talk about the importance of having people in the loop or leaders in the loop to make sure that these agents aren't kind of going off and doing things that maybe might not be ethical. But it really allows those whole value chains to get connected and actions to take place. Not just decisions, but actually make decisions and then act on them.
That's really an important framing. And the other piece of that framing I'd love for you to talk about is the 6-part leadership roadmap for navigating AI transformation that you share. Can you walk us through the most critical steps? I think a lot of leaders are sitting here wondering, right, but what are the discrete steps I need to take? So if you could maybe animate that for us, that would be great.
Yeah, that would be great. I think the first thing is really just to point out they're not linear steps like a ladder, right? They're all happening in parallel and continuously. So you don't complete a step like a checklist and then go, oh, great, thanks very much, I got that one, and then move on to the next one. It's all working in concert with each other on an ongoing basis. So first, I talk about leadership education. You have to educate yourself. You have to know what the technology is capable of. You have to use it yourself in your day-to-day work, and stay completely up to date with it. As you can imagine, it's constantly changing, constantly evolving, and continuing to stay up to date is an important. I talk about use cases and experimentation, and I think there are different levels, right? The first ones, the early ones, come from leaders and employees themselves coming up with ideas as to how existing work can be improved. Then you really have, end-to-end process improvement. So again, existing work, but rethinking that process end to end. And then finally, obviously, you have the new innovations and leveraging, agentic AI. You need to have a strategic vision, a business case. Business case might not be that important when you're first experimenting it, because you're building the organizational muscle, the ways of working, and so on. But as you start to scale AI, you really want to be prioritizing your money, your time, and your investments, just like anything else, on where you're going to get the maximum return of that investment. And then I talk about the importance of like job skills assessments, really actually understanding the jobs, where the biggest impacts are, where the biggest areas for automation might be. A job assessment, looking at all the skills, is one way of doing that. Another way might be looking at processes end to end and doing some kind of workflow assessment. But jobs is usually a pretty good way of going about analyzing the tasks. And then you need continuous processes for workforce planning. Like, as some tasks become obsolete and new tasks get created, you need to constantly be evolving the people, learning, reskilling, and changing what they do. And then, where necessary, just constantly moving people into other jobs where the growth areas are.
Thank you. That is really, I think, very useful to bear it out the way you did. One of the things you just mentioned is reskilling, and you emphasize that as a top workforce response. So what skills are organizations prioritizing, and what does that mean for L&D professionals from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think first is probably pretty obvious, which is what I was talking about before, which I think all roles are going to change to some extent. Research is saying, between half and 2/3, but this is a technology that's going to impact all of us, even in our personal lives. I'm using Claude at the weekend for all sorts of things at this moment in time. So I think knowing AI, having a level of AI awareness, what it can do, using it even as a one-off tool for tasks within your job, I think is very important. So I think the first thing is about AI literacy and educating yourself. I think the second thing, which is kind of more important and probably more where the question was coming from, are those skills that make us uniquely human. And that is emotional intelligence, empathy, strategic thinking, complex judgment, creativity, collaboration. All these skills become more important in the age of AI because they're more uniquely human. And the things that can be automated or covered by AI are going to happen. And I think L&D professionals have a huge responsibility right now, which is learning is a core driver of the success of AI adoption and AI scaling and taking place in organizations. And I think learning professionals who can work with their business leaders to embed learning in the flow of work is just a critical strategy on the adoption curve and scaling for AI.
I really hear that. And one of the points you make is that most leaders today focus on internal productivity rather than business model reinvention. What does that kind of genuine transformation look like? And what opportunities are leaders missing?
Yeah. So, I think the first thing is it's easy for leaders to look at what they currently do and then think about how can I make that more efficient? So I think first what we're seeing is leaders using it to do what they currently do, existing work faster, cheaper, better. As secondly, they're then looking at existing work, probably cross-functional processes and so on, and reinventing that work. But still, they're just optimizing the process, even if they're looking at end-to-end processes. And real transformation comes from new innovation, new products, new business models, thinking about customer relationships and new revenue streams that weren't possible before. Here I love that IKEA example. It's still one of the best examples I've seen.
Yeah, talk about it. I'd love to hear about it. And that you had a bank example as well. I'd love to hear about both of those examples. And what do they help us understand about the leadership of this?
Yeah, so the IKEA example, I think what's very instructive there is they realized that a lot of the call center work could be automated and covered by AI, which they did. And then what they did is they retrained 8,500 people in two kind of work streams, if you like. One was to handle the more complex inquiries and things that came in through the customer service center. And I go back to the skills that make you uniquely human, if you think of that again. And then I think, secondly, they also had a new idea for a new business model, which was customers being able to design their living rooms and put furniture in their living rooms and things in a 3D model online. And they wanted to give them access to interior designers to help them place this IKEA furniture in the rooms of their choices. And they retrained thousands of those customer service reps into interior design jobs to advise customers by the phone on how to design their living rooms and so on, which I think is like, that's exactly it, right? It's
Right.
one, is giving people more interesting, high value work for the people that stayed within the call center. And secondly, it's giving people completely new work that didn't exist before. And by the way, it created like over $1 billion in revenue that they didn't have before. And that's what I'm excited for us to see with this technology.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The horizon line is bright for those who adapt. So you talk about the importance actually of leaders adapting and role modeling AI adoption. which connects to your own doctoral research. Can you tell us about that finding in your research and what it means for how leaders should show up in this moment?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, the doctoral research I did, it clearly showed, at least more than any other leader, communications, meetings, promotions, whatever, that leadership role modeling was the thing that moved the needle more than anything else. And it was 2 times more effective than any of the other levers that could be used. And that's the same with AI. You can apply it to AI too. Leaders who visibly champion the technology, talk about it in their meetings, apply it to their own work, make it very clear the importance of AI and what they're expecting of people, integrate it into their decision making, and really as well be vulnerable, right? Realize that they're learning at the same time,
That's right.
and think about it with their teams, that they're learning with their teams. They're not like this authority figure who's got all the answers, because for sure nobody has all the answers right now.
No.
For example, I love the way things are evolving and changing. We've talked about coworker, and there's that famous quote by the CEO of NVIDIA about technology organizations are going to be the HR departments of the future.
Right, right.
Because they're going to be managing agents, right? They're going to be managing the technology. I do think it's a partnership between HR and technology, but I would say the work involved of AI and it being successful is about redesigning work, rethinking organization processes such as change, organization design, strategic workforce planning, learning and development. These are all people capabilities. And I actually think it's for the HR teams, the people function, to really step up at this time and lead this change in their organizations, partner with their technology organizations, but they should really be stepping up and leading in this space right now.
Yes. And so part of this, I know we've talked about this in the past, that you argue that old leadership models, traditional change management models are no longer adequate, right? And so could you specifically talk about what, from your research, what, and from your wisdom of practice, what needs to change and what does this mean for CLOs and learning leaders more broadly?
Yeah. So traditional change management approaches really assume a journey from A to B.
Yes.
And it's about getting you from A to B and then back to business as usual. Well, with AI in this environment, there is no business as usual. There is no going back. There is no stabilization and then, oh, let's start the new change again. It's continuous, it's ongoing, constantly being adaptable and flexing, and needing to go with it. And that requires dynamic organization capabilities. It requires people to be flexible, and it requires people to carry on learning and continually learn. And as I've mentioned before, it requires all these strategic workforce practices, change, org design, strategic workforce planning, and so on, to be continuous, ongoing, iterative. I don't think it's about having a framework in a linear way and then sticking with it.
That's right. It's about adaptivity, and it's about agility, right? And I know you and I both study organizational agility and leader agility. And you describe in your chapter, you describe organizational agility as a critical competitive capability in the AI era. Can you tell us, what does it actually take to build an agile organization? And how does learning sit at the heart of that?
So, organizational agility is the ability to acquire new knowledge, generate new thinking, and then disseminate that new learning and thinking rapidly throughout the organization. What we've seen with AI with the early adopters is that this is a strategic imperative. It's not a nice to have. And those companies that are best positioned to capitalize on the opportunities that AI bring have already made foundational investments in things like strong data infrastructure, governance, digital literacy. They've embedded skills across their workforce,
Exactly.
agile ways of working, culture. All those things enable the experimentation of this technology, the empowerment of their people, and high trust environments that allow that technology to scale, and people to adopt it. So it really is, I think, in the AI era, key to the adoption of AI.
Absolutely. And to the priming of the system in the humanistic way that you describe in your chapter, where it's a really people centered, productivity centered way of thinking about that priming of the system and of the employee set. So I want to ask you the multi-billion-dollar question, which is I'm working myself on an AI fear index for adoption for leaders. And one of the top fears is job displacement. We know this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how should leaders be talking about this with their people? How can they help people understand? Because we're also hearing people are firing workforce and then having to rehire that same workforce. We're starting to hear in the AI space that it's not quite as simple as we thought. So I'd love for you to really help us understand the contours of this moment, especially for leaders who need to both be thinking about priming in people-centered ways, but then also, really honestly engaging with people's concerns. So I'd love to learn from your wisdom and for our listeners to learn from all you know around this, because you've worked with so many top companies.
The thing is there is a significant impact on employment and jobs with regards to AI. But the reality is that it's often at the task level. So you're often looking at 20% of jobs, 40% of tasks within a job, not necessarily whole jobs. And what we're really seeing is that firms have been very cautious about this. So they're getting productivity gains, they're adjusting jobs, but generally what they're doing is they're going for hiring freezes or slowing down recruiting and things like that. And when you look at the research of, 4,000 jobs here or 2,000 jobs here, and I kind of I talk about this in the chapter as well, very often they're anticipated jobs over the next 3 or 4 years, most of which will actually be, those reductions will be fulfilled by hiring freezes, not adding jobs and completing jobs. They're not actually layoffs of people, although there are cases where there are layoffs of people. And the reality is you've got a lag between the technology, people learning that technology being adopted, and then the new jobs being created, the new growth being created based on those technology platforms. So there will be a reconfiguration of work, a reconfiguration of jobs. And I think the best protection that people have is really to retrain, reskill, and keep themselves up to date, to keep their skills relevant and themselves marketable.
Exactly. Themselves and their people, right? And that's part of their message is the more literate and agile you are in AI, the more longevity you have. So resisting it out of fear is actually a backwards logic. It's part of what I try to help, leaders and organizations understand. And I think your chapter really gives a lot of the substantive reasons why that is the case. So I'm a listener. I'm hearing everything you're saying, and I'm thinking to myself, I feel really overwhelmed, and I don't know really where to start. So what would be your message to leaders who feel overwhelmed? What do they need to act on now?
I think leaders really, I'm going to come back to educating themselves, really learning and understanding the technology, using the technology and looking for ways that they can apply it. Start with some small use cases, experiment with it, and then take it from there. But I think if you don't get started, you're going to see other people are going to get started, and then you're going to be back to what I was talking about before, which is you're watching others and then you're going to get left behind.
And you will. And that's part of the message, right? Adapt, and adapt quickly, and adapt well, and help your people adapt in ways that are honest and also really affirm the need for them to really hop on this train. So you referenced David Autor's challenge to leaders that our thinking should not be limited by what the technology can do, but by what we want it to do for us. What does that mean in practice tomorrow for the leader?
Yeah. So that really kind of cuts right at the heart of what separates leaders who truly capture AI's potential from those that are just going to scratch the surface. Most leaders approach AI by saying, well, what can the technology do for me? And then looking for places where they can apply it. Autor's challenge is to invert that question entirely and start with the outcomes you want. Your customers, your employees, your community, and then ask about how AI can help you get there. So this is basically in practice, start with what are the biggest business problems you face? What are the pain points that you have? What are the processes that frustrate customers? What are the bottlenecks that slow down your teams? The service gaps you've never been able to address? Start with your problems and the outcomes that you're looking for, and then go to how can the technology help us resolve those? And if you like, kind of work backwards from there, and that will help you get to transformative AI applications versus just, improving existing work.
That's right. So if you're a learning professional, you're an HR leader, you're a CLO, you're listening to this, you're thinking about how your own roles are changing and how you stay relevant in this age of AI, what advice do you have?
We talked about the skills that people need going forward, that AI cannot easily replicate. And we've talked about the importance of learning and education. So I think first is building your own AI literacy.
That's right.
And your own learning. So, for example, I'm going to the ATD conference this year in May and going to be speaking on this topic. But I'm excited to go because I want to go around all the stands and find out what some of the latest thinking is in AI in regards to learning, how it's been applied. And this conference is a great way of making me focus, getting me out of myself and giving me dedicated time to look at it. The second is think about strategically your role. What are the capabilities your organization needs to compete in the next 3 to 5 years? And have business conversations with your business leaders about how learning can help you get there. And I think thirdly is just be conscious that this is constantly evolving.
That's right.
So just because you go to a conference in May, doesn't mean to say I'm going to have the answers for a long period of time, right? I'm going to have to constantly be following up and constantly learning and really investing a chunk of my time in continuing to stay up to date.
Absolutely. And up to date is by the week. It's really by the
Yes.
week. So as we close, what is the most important thing that you hope that readers and listeners will take away from the chapter and the book as a whole?
I think every leader today is making choices. Even if they choose to do nothing, they're making a choice to get left behind. And I think whether people come through this and their teams come through this well and continue to be employed and relevant and everything else is about choices leaders make, choices to offer them learning, reskilling, experiment with the technologies. And I think those leaders that are really going to define their organizations are the future, are those that even go further and think about it in terms of innovation,
Exactly.
think about AI in terms of new products, new revenue streams, how it's going to help with customer relationships, in client-facing possibilities. And I think really leading through this transition, because this is going to be a time of transition over the next few years as we go from before AI to after AI, and helping people navigate that successfully is all going to come down to leadership choices, which is why I love this book and the naming of this book in terms of leaders as architects of change, which is leaders, they're not passengers, they're not observers, but they're really in the driving seat. It's not about AI dictating the future. It's you deciding how you're going to apply it.
Yes.
And the choices you make now is going to determine the future of work. And I think leaders as architects of change, I think, is a great way of framing it.
Bridie, as you know, my respect and love for you is immense, and you are a really important voice in the field, and I'm delighted that we can learn from you today. Thank you so much for your wisdom, for your chapter, and for your vision. I really appreciate you. Thank you.
Oh, Sharon, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you so much for inviting me to contribute to the book. Thank you.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to the end of another enriching episode of The Practitioner Scholar, the PennCLO podcast. We hope you found inspiration in the stories and insights shared today. These narratives serve as a testament to the transformative impact that well-informed leadership can have across organizations and industries. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and stay engaged as we continue to explore the ever-evolving landscape of leadership and learning. Thank you, and goodbye until next time.